Hey everyone, thanks for joining us on this panel, this controversial panel with the proposition of can Ethereum win again? And I'm honored to have 3 brilliant panelists alongside with me. So I'm going to invite each of them to introduce themselves, and before we kind of go into a couple of high-level context to start the discussion.
Yeah, so I'm Jacob. I'm CSO at Celestia Labs.
Hey everybody, I'm Lane. I do research at Near Foundation focused on governance and AI and the intersection of those. And in the context of this conversation, I'm a former Ethereum core developer and was formerly part of the Ethereum Foundation.
Hi everyone, I cover Ethereum protocol development and governance. You might know me most for my coverage on the Ethereum developer calls, the ACD calls. I recently started covering those on my own Substack, but previously I've covered these calls for Galaxy and for CoinDesk.
And myself, my name is GM, currently partner at Dragonfly. We're a crypto-native venture fund. Previously, was an engineer at Chainlink, managing Chainlink's MEV product, and then before that, got into crypto in 2018, building an EVM chain. And so, for the purpose of the discussion, the proposition is: can Ethereum win again? And I think it's
the answer is no. See you guys later. Bye. Sorry.
And no, that's great. We actually had a very fierce debate just now between Christine and Lane in the back room.
The answer is yes.
Yeah. But I think it would be helpful for the audience, especially those who kind of might not be following closely as to what's happening in crypto, as to why are we having this discussion in the first place. And so I think here's a couple of charts that I put up over this morning, and part of the discussion obviously was Solana, which has been one of the smart contract chains that's been grown extremely popular in the past year. And for a very long time, Ethereum had pride itself in terms of volumes and usage on the chain, until very recently, Solana for the first time overtook Ethereum very briefly, right, for a 3-month period, both in terms of on-chain DEX volumes and in terms of fees, and that's largely driven by the amount of meme coin trading activities, fueled by pumped up fund. But what's interesting now is, if you look at April, we're now actually back at square one, right? Like Ethereum and Solana is neck and neck when it comes to that on-chain volume and fees. The other part that people still don't realize, I think, kind of underappreciated, is even though we're having this discussion and a lot of people are flooding Ethereum today, Ethereum still remains as the top chain when it comes to stablecoin supply, and it's just miles ahead of Solana and also TVL, right? And so that's, I guess, something I would hope to, from my panelists to discuss as to can we potentially take that, advantage and how we leverage that into the future. And yeah, the third big theme I would say that happened in the past year is, again, in the broader EVM land, one of the biggest shifts we saw was a lot of the on-chain EVM activity moved from ETH mainnet over to Base, right, which is the rollup that Coinbase launched. And now right now in terms of all EVM chains, Base is actually on par with BNB when it comes to usage, and also you can see that just clearly from a dollar flow perspective. So yeah, and I guess I'll probably skip this, which is on the context of dank sharding and kind of how rollups are now post dank sharding. Fundamentally, rollups are now allowed to capture more of their own economic value as to paying those in fees onto Ethereum, the mainnet. And so I guess I'll start the discussion by asking the question of, in this context of discussing, can Ethereum win again? One of the things we were chatting backstage was we realized we all see Ethereum as a very different thing, right? And so how do you define, or what is Ethereum for you, personally?
Well, I think the starting point is that it's primarily, I think, a brand and an ecosystem at the moment. I think it's sort of like Linux. I think a lot of people in the Ethereum world, I think, are very scared of this analogy, but I do think it has a Linux type of, a lot of parallels. The EVM is really widely adopted. Even not just that, a lot of the other tooling is, it has been taken up. But the bigger thing is, it is obviously also a network. I think the only thing that's purely Ethereum is probably the L1 at the end of the day, and the L2, all the L2s and rollups. At the moment, they're obviously all raised external capital. They have sort of different different incentives and responsibilities, and that's kind of what the tension that people like to talk about is. But I think at the end of the day, the only thing that is purely Ethereum is probably Ethereum L1 from a product perspective. But then the ecosystem is obviously, and the brand obviously. One of its biggest strengths is just that it travels really, really widely, and it has this insane, pretty. The fact that people even care about all these problems and want to fix it is kind of testament to the fact that it's clearly more than just a single chain, right?
And then, if you view Ethereum as a brand, would you say, as a brand, is Ethereum winning or losing as to that proposition?
I think it's losing more as a brand than as a product, or as a brand than a product right now. In the sense that there's not a lot of people who want to really associate too tightly right now with Ethereum beyond folks who are maybe building things like base rollups or where it's actually to their benefit, to do so. So as a brand, I think it's just really hard because you have a really valuable ETH is just worth so much. Still, it's still worth so much relative to the fees. That's just pretty much every blockchain. But Ethereum is the second largest, so it gets has to get the most scrutiny. And then the other thing is that I think the question is it losing as a product? And I think as for rollups, it's definitely. It sort of has dual integrate. It has two different ways of connecting with or supporting rollups, right? So one is by chains that basically post their DA, everything, settle, etc. And there's chains that settle, but maybe they do other things. They get their assets through layer 0, or they they get, and they don't use ETH as their gas token. They use DA layers like Celestia or Eigen or something like this. And those in that way, Ethereum. I think the one big point of confusion, last thing I'll say on this, is that it's not that Ethereum is necessarily losing; it's that you just can't build a lot of the things that people want to build in a high throughput way at the moment. So you couldn't build Hyperliquid on Ethereum natively. You can't build most of, if the Trump token launched on Ethereum L2, it just wouldn't work. Not for the reasons that people think. It's not just throughput. It's actually that, the way that people bridge into Ethereum rollups is usually through either the native bridge or it's through intent bridge, or people get there through intent bridges. And in the case of native bridge, you have this really high CAC to get to onboard users, or you need to use something like Across or Relay or whatever. And the problem is that those intent bridges are reliant on solvers, and the inventory is very limited on these chains. So if you wanted to have $4 billion move from lots of places into an Ethereum L2 today, you just can't. It just wouldn't work. And so what does that mean? Well, it means that you end up with chains like Base, where people can onboard through Coinbase, and that's kind of where the whole Ethereum is Coinbase sort of FUD comes from. But it's also true. There's just this fact that if you want to build a scalable thing, you actually end up relying on basically off-chain centralized infrastructure, that CCTP, whatever. So I think that's the dimension where it's struggling at the moment. I don't think it's that it's. I think it's it's also not very well diagnosed by people, but that's the dimension where it's struggling. But I think if they were to really prioritize, just focus on prioritizing, at least either fixing that CAC problem, or scaling the L1 a lot, or somehow magically, massively scaling blobs or something, that would obviously help.
And Lane, how do you view Ethereum, and what's Ethereum to you? And in that lens, do you think Ethereum is winning or losing?
Yeah, I think I broadly agree with what Jacob said. I think there's I often use the phrase big Ethereum and little Ethereum, right? So little Ethereum is what you call pure Ethereum, right? That's kind of mainnet, it's ETH the asset, it's the kind of existing data structure, which is basically the minimalistic kind of interpretation of Ethereum, and then the maximal includes absolutely everything. And it's a very complicated Venn diagram. We were, kind of talking about it backstage. There's the software implementations of Ethereum, the protocol. There's the abstract concept of the protocol. The protocol evolves over time. There's the community. There's obviously the asset. There's all the L2s. It's many things, right? If you kind of look at the maximal interpretation. There's EVM, I think we want to talk a little bit about that. I think, so you use the term brand. I like that a lot. I use the term meme. I also threw out a cult or religion. I mean, I think they all amount to basically the same thing. ETH is like a shared story, right? And the example I like to give is we run these events. I think ETH Denver is probably the best example because it's so big. It has ETH in the name. I don't know if folks here are aware, but it's actually not an Ethereum exclusive event. It never has been, which is why we've always had speakers at ETH Denver from many other projects. Why is it called ETH Denver? It's just a sticky meme. You know, it's like it attracts people. Yeah, I mean, I think even at ETH Seoul here, like there were other people talking about things besides Ethereum, right? So yeah, I think kind of ETH is a meme. I think ETH as a meme, actually, I think is pretty healthy. We could kind of debate this. And I'm a builder. I'm sort of hyper-focused on the developer experience, the developer lens, and I think as a technology and as a brand for builders specifically, Ethereum is actually doing very well. It still leads, and I think actually the developer activity has spiked recently.
Yeah, I agree very broadly with what was shared. I view primarily, and I cover Ethereum primarily through the lens of Ethereum, the L1, like as a technology, as a public blockchain protocol. And so I define Ethereum as an open source technology that is uniquely governed by this amorphous group of stakeholders, of a decentralized set of stakeholders that over the years has changed in major ways. Like miners used to be a major stakeholder group in Ethereum, but now it's stakers. That is, I think, very different from other types of open source technologies like Linux, which is very much controlled and organized by a more centralized entity. So when you look at protocols like Bitcoin and Ethereum, they are open source technologies, but what's very cool about them is that they are governed in this very, like, almost, it's like like an amorphous group of stakeholders is really the way I'm starting to put it. I do think that Ethereum, in terms of adoption as an open source technology, is by far succeeding. It is, again, from the metrics, like one of the most top, like widely adopted and known like cryptocurrencies in the world. I think, though, as a community, the governance part of who controls the blockchain and how do decisions get made, as Ethereum has pivoted to a roll-up-centric roadmap, the cohesion of the community about what Ethereum, the open source technology, should be and do, that part has started to disintegrate, like the collective community cohesion. And I think that is a big part of why we're even having this conversation of can Ethereum win again, because people are confused of what Ethereum is trying to be as a technology. So yeah.
And like on that topic of, as Christine, you're obviously like follow the Ethereum updates the most closest with the upcoming Petra. Clearly, Ethereum is doubling down, on that roll-up-centric roadmap. And like, what's your, if you were in charge, let's say, to design, hey, like, what is Ethereum still uniquely good at that it should win on, or it could win on? How would you define that?
That's a hard question because I don't know if I have high convictions about Ethereum's success as either like an L1 monolithic blockchain or as a modular Celestia-like DA layer. I will say, I will say, despite the numbers and the data saying that it doesn't make sense, yes, I think developers doubling down on the roll-up-centric roadmap, doubling the blob capacity in Petra, focusing on PeerDAS in Fusaka is the right move, that they are prioritizing the right thing. it's for me as a researcher, it's very hard for me to say this because all numbers show that it's not the right move. There is no indication other than these like theoretical visions of based and native rollups that are going to require actually some other significant changes on the L1 aside from data availability to even implement. I think it was, who was it? I think it was like Cami from the Defiant that was saying these like hand-wavy solutions of how Ethereum will have value accrual as a DA layer. All parts of me want to reject and say that Ethereum should focus on the L1, but I've talked to enough researchers and I've dug deep enough into scalable blockchains through DA and modularization that, as difficult as it is, I do think that developers are making the right choice by doubling down on Pectra, and I wouldn't suggest them to do otherwise.
How about you guys?
Yeah, so I think that this is actually the core of the problem for Ethereum, which is actually that basically there's a lot of different actors in the ecosystem that are pulling in like sort of different ways. Like so they get like OP base, the other L2s and stuff that use blobs, they uniquely benefit from increase like a 2x in Pectra or a 10x or whatever it is in Fusaka. Those increases are like entirely, the benefit almost entirely goes to the users and the but primarily developers. It's really developers of the rollups per se. But like the global system, like the whole Ethereum as a whole, it might not necessarily be the global maximum. Like you might not be going towards like what actually would be best for the entire system by prioritizing that. And that's the difficult thing about prioritization is that you have to sacrifice something. You should, like the whole point, I mean, a lot of times we have the ability to subvert trade-offs, great, whatever, but I think the only, the truth is that, unless there's prioritization, there's just going to be kind of like this constant questioning of like, are we making, it's not even really measurable, right? Because, if you increase the blobs by 2x, but then, basically, people want, gigagas. Well, even with Fusaka, you can't do gigagas rollups at their capacity, right? And so, like, it can do maybe like half of one or maybe one. And so, the truth is just that, like, there basically needs to be some level of prioritization of like what exactly Ethereum superpowers. And personally, I think that's the $100 billion on the L1, and the CAC and the ability to reduce the CAC, the ability to acquire users as a rollup from the Ethereum L1. Have like you launch a token, you launch it on the L1 because it's where all the exchange integrations are, and like that's kind of like what Ethereum's moat has always been for quite a long time, and that just feels like like a place where you can actually kind of win, and I think Ethereum L1 looking more and more like things like Monad or something like that would, even if it's 1/20th, even if it's 1/10th of the gas target of Monad, would be more likely to produce like a differentiating outcome than just like marginally increasing the blobs for like these L2s that aren't necessarily, they're all looking at various options anyway, right? And so it doesn't necessarily, it might not even fix the problem for them even in the next few months. Like they may still have pressure. So I think that's the question is like prioritization is about sacrifice. The question is like you basically have to sacrifice some local optimization. Someone's going to lose in that process. And the only thing that matters is really like the global outcome at the end of the day, because like that's what we're all talking about. Like, is basically how is Ethereum doing in like this global sense, right?
I agree very strongly with what Jacob's saying. I think prioritization is key, and I think Ethereum has been struggling with this question for a very long time. And I think it's evident when you look at the rotating narratives that Ethereum has been through over the years. Ethereum kind of tried on a bunch of different narratives for size and fit, and they kind of didn't really fit, and they were kind of discarded, right? So like ultrasound money is a good example of this. It was a DeFi chain for a while, it was an NFT chain for a while, it was a world computer for a while. I think I'm missing a few there. I think Ethereum can be whatever it wants to be still, but it needs to figure out what it wants to be first. And for the reason that you stated a moment ago, which is that there's this massive set of unaligned kind of actors and stakeholders, like a very diverse set of stakeholders, it makes it very, very difficult to get alignment on what Ethereum wants to be. And other projects that are a little bit more centralized in their governance or have like a really strong visionary leader figure, or are just simpler. Like, Monad is a good example of this. Like, I think they're doing a great job because the job they're trying to do is much simpler than what Ethereum is trying to be, right? Ethereum's trying to be many things to many people. Monad is like, we're just going to push the envelope, absolute maximal, throughput. I mean, reduce latency as much as possible, that kind of thing. I think, again, Ethereum still has a window of opportunity to do this, but I'm not bullish on people aligning on that narrative and making the sacrifices you're talking about. My personal opinion, probably the strongest narrative Ethereum has going for itself at this moment is the maximally trusted, maximally credibly neutral base layer, like kind of settlement layer. And the way I would respond to the question you asked earlier about upcoming upgrades and increasing blob space, et cetera, like how do they serve that mission? To the extent that you believe that's the mission, I don't necessarily see how they serve that mission.
And kind of to go in that direction, if you believe, right, like Ethereum's unique strength is in this credibly neutral layer, and again, perhaps back to the slides that we've shown, Ethereum still has like a huge amount of stable coins and a huge amount of TVA on the chain, and a couple of other ongoing updates that people might not be following. Ethereum today is still one of the top chains when it comes to top like TradFi institutional asset issuance, right? We had BlackRock, BUIDL / Securitize issue their funds on Ethereum, and that has never been done on any other chain. And we also had recently, Etherealize, trying to push towards that direction. Like, curious to hear your guys' thinking on. Do you think that would be a direction that could drive Ethereum to win again?
Yeah, so I think that's definitely more in the right direction in the sense that especially if you scale the L1 and you focus a lot on asset issuance, you focus on it being like that economic home base sort of. So I actually think this institutional stuff is actually related to the problem in the sense that basically before stablecoins, all of like distribution, users, et cetera, came from crypto native assets. Ether, like even Maker like emerged because of people wanting to borrow against ETH, et cetera. And once USDC arrived, USDC doesn't really care where it lives, really. Like it does in the sense that, like, as a user, you don't want to hold it on a scary chain, but it doesn't really care. It's an oracle at the end of the day. There's a sense in which it's basically permission. They can sort of change who owns the thing, right? You can allow list, block list, etc. The thing is, with all of these institutional assets and RWAs, these are even more. They care even less about where they are. They actually don't care. In fact, they're all a lot of them partner with Layer 0, and like Layer 0, basically, when you use Layer 0, they issue a different version of the asset. ERC20 is an extension of ERC20 OFT that basically allows it to just move everywhere, wherever, and then they do these deals with all these L1s and chains and L2s to bring them there. And so at the end of the day, what's going to matter is where is their demand. And basically, is that L1? Well, right now L1 doesn't scale, and so demand, it's hard for it to scale up and to meet that kind of demand. And that seems to me like the easiest path to be successful in the asset issuance or institutional side. But institutional adoption, like by itself, I think is actually arguably, and the increase in RWAs are arguably bad for Ethereum. Like, it's actually potentially worse for Ethereum than if it didn't happen, because otherwise most people would want to be bootstrapping off of some small set of stable coins and ETH, which are just on the L1.
I view Ethereum's like winning and being a very successful open source technology. Like, I'm very bullish on Ethereum, the technology. And I do think that Ethereum remains the general purpose blockchain that is the furthest along in solving the problem of having very high throughput, scalable, decentralized. Like, the reason why we would want to put finance on a blockchain, put finance on chain, Ethereum is still the best place to do it and the furthest along in solving the problems to make sure that that can be a reality. And I think it succeeds in that sense. Like, Ethereum succeeds as the general purpose blockchain that the world uses. Like the what do you call it? The world computer? The world computer, the global computer. However, in that future, because of the design that I see Ethereum and probably all other public blockchains converging towards, I'm very bearish on ETH, the asset, on gas tokens, on their value, because I don't see a very strong value accrual mechanism for them in the future, in the long-term future. So, yeah. So I think I'm bullish on Ethereum, with a bit of a caveat that I'm defining Ethereum as the protocol and the asset value to be just enough that it continues to allow the operation of the Ethereum blockchain.
I think we should talk more about that last point you made about kind of the value of the asset, value accrual. But just to respond to the first thing you said about Ethereum being kind of, global financial settlement layer, I think I disagree, because Ethereum made what I consider to be like a fatal mistake of adopting this quote-unquote modular topology, modular architecture, and I think it was a huge mistake. I think it didn't have to be this way. This has come up a couple times this week on various panels and conversations. Like, there was a moment before Ethereum embraced the roll-up centric roadmap, and I've been in Ethereum long enough to remember when that happened and why that happened and how that happened. When we were considering something like a sharded model, which looked more like the way Near works, for example. And I just think, like, the user experience, when you break that composability, you break things into multiple namespaces, you introduce asynchronicity, it's just a horrible user experience, and the fragmentation of liquidity as well. So when I go into a shop and transact on traditional financial rails, and I pull out my Visa card, I don't need to care about which network the vendor exists on and which network my wallet's on. If I do a peer-to-peer payment to Jacob, like using Venmo or PayPal or whatever your app of choice is, like, I don't have to think about these things. So, and I also would say I don't see a way of fixing it in Ethereum without radical changes that are just like nowhere to be seen on the roadmap.
I disagree with that. Ethereum can very easily triple its L1 block space, like, trivially. For Fusaka, developers are potentially thinking about prioritizing 100 million block gas limit. Right now it's at like 36 million. But there are these like quirks, I would say, in the protocol that prevent developers from being able to do this. That, though, is like not the technical challenge that client teams are really like struggling with to figure out, like, oh dang, like, how are we gonna radically scale our L1? It's more like we're very focused on data availability sampling. We're very focused on trying to figure out how do we make Ethereum a scalable DA layer. Can we do that at the same time as scaling the L1? And I think there's more consensus now that developers can. I think based on the conversations for Fusaka, there's a greater push, there's a greater like energy for doing the easy changes to triple Ethereum's scalability as an L1 and also deliver peer DAS. Unfortunately, developers historically have always been far more ambitious and not very realistic about how easily they can like have their cake and eat it too. But I think that Ethereum still has all the users and they can very easily scale the L1 to retain their market share. And now that push has come to shove, I think developers are leaning more towards that direction. I still think that it remains, though, that the biggest technical challenge that Ethereum developers are facing is not related really to L1 scale, but actually making this DA vision, this roll-up centric vision, a reality.
I just think it's too little too late. I think 3x is not going to cut it. I think we need 1,000x, and I think we need it way faster than 5 years to be able to do the kind of things we're talking about. That was always true, and it's like extra true now that other chains are offering much faster block times, faster consensus, much higher throughput, et cetera.
Yeah, I agree. I think the biggest thing, though, is actually that is again just like the amount of complexity and like what you're describing in terms of like all the things. Like it's just so much. And actually, the thing I often think about is like, why are rollups on Ethereum at all? Why do people, when you talk to even a developer, like why are they deploying it there? Well, they're deploying it there because like that's where the users are, which is the L1. The truth is that basically like that's where all the leverage comes from. Like it doesn't come from like scaling. It doesn't come from like to some extent maybe it comes from like reliability, right? Like battle testedness, etc. But we already know that people will start using chains that like barely work like Solana if they can get better access to users, right? And so there's a sense in which like there's basically like all the leverage basically for this whole system comes from the L1, the existing liquidity, like bootstrapping off of that when you launch a new chain or build something on a roll up or something. And it just seems like there's like this there's like this confusion about like exactly why people use the product, and so it leads to like we should just try everything, because then if we try everything, there's a chance that like one of these things might work. But the truth is like it's not how product like how you build a good product. Like you build a good product by like really building something that people are like really like and they get addicted to, right? And
I think Ethereum got away with that for a long time because it was the only game in town, but that's not true anymore, right?
Yeah, I think that's the other thing. I think deregulation, Ethereum is the biggest, has the biggest trouble from like how quickly post-Trump, like how quickly the deregulation accelerated, because a lot of its moat also comes from kind of like it's of course it's the second asset that has an ETF. It's the asset that's like not under as many investigations by the SEC. Like there's just like this sort of incredible moat that it had from being like battle tested and older and like having been through those trials and tribulations and stuff. And I think that's like a lot of what we're seeing is actually like if you really want to diagnose like what actually happened, like it's really that change or that change in the landscape that like really created like a different set of constraints and environment for Ethereum. And so understanding that means that you have to like, okay, well like the solution when you end up in a situation like that is to really focus on like a very specific direction that you can win as fast as possible. And like that's how you adjust to that kind of shock. That's like I think that's like the only thing that points to like what the way forward is.
I don't know if that's the strategy that has been winning historically in the crypto industry. And if you define winning not by asset prices, but by the adoption of the technology, like Ethereum's strategy is still winning. So
you can tell this is one of the most contentious topics that in all of crypto today. And again, really appreciate my amazing panelists for sharing their unique perspectives in terms of just like even how differently like each of us view Ethereum and define Ethereum as like is just fascinating to me that like we all see Ethereum from a different perspective, and we love to continue this discussion with you guys offline. And so thanks so much for listening in. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.